The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning. Today is June 21st. I'm Donna Will. I'm Professional Development Coordinator for the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and we welcome you to the Trauma-Informed Care Training with Dr. Karen Harvey. And before we get started, we're going to go over a few things. We are in listen-only mode today, but you can use the chat. I think we have questions at the end. So you can use that to ask questions, and then we'll handle those at the end. We don't have any handouts for this webinar, and we will be recording the webinar. So if you missed anything, we'll be able to give you the link to listen to it again. So without further ado, good morning, Karen Harvey.
Good morning. Hello, Maryland. Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here. And from the bottom of my heart, it is an honor to be given this opportunity by DDA to really talk to people and reach as many people as possible about this really, really important topic. And that's trauma and people with intellectual disabilities. So my story is that I've been in the field for a long, long time, but I love telling people about my first week. And you're probably like, your first week? Well, the first week in my field, I went for a job. I had my master's in psychology and I was doing therapy. And I realized that I wasn't that good of a therapist. I was like, don't you have a friend you can talk to? What's your problem? So, not good at all. And I realized I'm single and I'm broke and I have to make a living, but this therapy thing, I feel like people are asking me what to do with their lives. I don't know what they should do. I'm in my 20s. What the heck is your problem? Get it together. I wasn't as caring as I thought. I've grown, yes, but at that point I was like, okay, well then I need to find some way to make a living. So I started interviewing for jobs, and I interviewed for a job for an agency called Maryland Homes for the Handicapped. What a weird name, right? I was like, what's that? And I'm sitting in the lobby, and one person after another starts introducing themselves to me, telling me their life story. I'm just like, I love these people. This one lady came up kind of screaming, I need a sponsor to take me to church. I need a sponsor. No one will take me to church. And I was like, I'll take you to church. I just became a Buddhist, but what the heck? Let's do this. Another guy's like, I got a girlfriend, just like he caught a fish. This other lady comes over and she's complaining and complaining and complaining. Everybody's so mean to her. Everybody's so horrible to her. And I was like, oh, I can help you. And I felt motivated. So I went in and I gave that interview everything I had, just really turned it on. And I got the job as behavior specialist for Maryland Homes for the Handicapped. And I also found out later two things that were really important. Number one was that I was the only applicant. And number two was that I was also the janitorial instructor. They forgot that part, that I had to run a janitorial crew every day. And then write behavior plans somewhere in there. You know how it was in the early days of the nonprofits? And everybody was just opening up. I'm very, very old. And Rosewood was where most people with disabilities were. And so most of the folks were in Rosewood, and these little agencies were starting up in order to bring people out of Rosewood and serve them in the community. And they had never done that before. So it was a very exciting time. And I just kind of walked into this situation. So in that first month, several things happened that were really informative. The first thing, I always like to tell this story because I had to shadow the guy who was the instructor for the janitorial crew, with the crew, folks with disabilities. We were working as a crew cleaning 3 churches. And every time I saw the priest, there was one priest in charge. His name was Father Joe. And every time I saw him, I would try to introduce myself. Hi, Father Joe, my name is Karen. Father Joe, I'm going to take, and he just would ignore me. Happened day after day until the last day, I was like desperate to meet him. And I'm sitting with the guys and we're eating lunch. And Father Joe walks in, and that's when I realized what was really happening, because everybody on the crew all tries to say hi to Father Joe. Hey, Father Joe. Hi, Father Joe. Father Joe. And he looks at all of them and looks away, myself included. I'm like, hi, Father Joe, my name's Karen. Ignores all of us, walks over to the instructor and says, hey, Kelly, how are you? I got some work for you to do. And I've been wondering how you've been doing. I heard you got a promotion. And they're shooting the breeze. And I realized that he thought I was one of the people on the crew, which, you know, you would probably think that too if you had met me at that time. But at the same time, I was like, it is not okay that they're invisible. Wow. How does that feel for them? What are they going through? That's so tough. And they kept trying to talk to him, and maybe every now and then he would throw them a bone and just give a wave or acknowledge something. But for the most part, you know, he just ignored everybody. And then I thought, well, maybe he's just really horrible. But actually, he was kind of a nice guy. And when we went to get something to eat, people would ignore them and ask me what they wanted to eat. And when we went to the mall, people would act like, you know, they were going to attack their children sometimes. And my eyes were open like, oh my goodness, this is a hard way to live, with the whole world acting like you don't exist. Or if they see you, that they have to kind of get away from you or get their children away. And I thought, wow, that's hard. And then I said to the supervisor that I had at the time, it was you know, if you have a master's in psychology, back then, now you can get a license, and it's a beautiful thing. Back then, you had to be under the license of a PhD. So I talked to the PhD supervising me, and I said, I really want to do therapy with these folks. You know, no one's listening to them, and they have so many issues, and half of them just came out of the institution. I really want to do this. And he said, oh, you can't do therapy with those people. And he was also a nice guy. It was just the going way. So there was such a misunderstanding of people, as though they were from another planet, like, oh, that species we don't do therapy with, and you don't really talk to them, and they have attention-seeking behaviors. And I was just like, oh my goodness, these are some of the nicest people, some of the best people I've ever met. And they're being treated worse than your pet, you know? And so I started doing therapy, and I started talking to people, and I started hearing their stories. And I went back to school so that I could do more therapy. And when I finished and I started working in agencies and supervising people to do therapy, and we also wrote behavior plans, but we heard one trauma story after another, horrible stories. And I started realizing how much abuse there was. And so I went back and started to study trauma, because we didn't learn about trauma in graduate psychology programs back then. No one really talked about it. It was just assumed to be associated with vets and war and the effects of war. So I studied everything that I could and started to realize that so many people that I work with had post-traumatic stress disorder. And so many of their behavioral issues were really trauma responses and symptoms of PTSD in many cases. So this talk today has evolved out of many years, you know, and I've worked in this field ever since. So it's been over 35 years. And I've learned that there's ways to heal. There's ways to heal. And we can support people, and people do support people in ways that are very healing. But there's also ways to re-traumatize people. So we can go either way. And in this talk, I want to talk first about the sources of trauma for people with intellectual disabilities, which are vast. And then I'm going to talk about the effects of that trauma. And then we're going to look at, see, how that's going to be very depressing. So then go do something fun after that, because that's day one. But day two is much better. Day two, we're going to look at ways that people heal and how to support people. So, and we'll have time for questions at the end in both cases. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have to apologize because I don't have my usual technology, and hopefully all this will work. Here we go. Okay. I'm clicking on it, but of course it's not working. I'm trying to share my screen, and for some reason, I don't know why it won't let me. I'm having a hard time sharing my screen, Donna.
So, were you able to open up the sharing section in your panel?
It says show screen.
Excuse me? Oh, click the little flower at the bottom of your computer, and that'll bring up the panel.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Sorry about this. I'm going to keep telling stories while I do this because somehow that's not opening up. It's always something, isn't it? Okay. So as I said, that first month, really, I'm clicking go to webinar and it's not working. Settings, should I click on?
Do you see the panel? Is it up? Is the panel up?
I don't. I see waiting to view organizer's screen. Let me see. Make another presenter. Show screen. I have a very limited panel. Okay. Showing. It says I'm showing my screen.
Oh, it's my fault. I am so sorry, Karen. I did not make you an
That's
organizer. Okay. I am so sorry. Or presenter.
No
Hold on.
problem. No problem. Thank goodness it's not my fault.
It was
I don't
not
care.
your fault. It was my fault.
That's great news. Okay, here we
go. You have the presenter question before you.
Okay, show my screen. Okay, now let me pull it up and we'll see if you can see. Thank you all for bearing with us. Okay. So I want to tell you that in that first month also, I was starting to go to Rosewood and bring people out from the institution. Now, let me just ask you, can you all see this? Can you see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Yay! I'm going to celebrate for a minute. Okay, I'm done. Just a joyful moment. But going into Rosewood, I saw such horrific things. I don't know if you all have seen the YouTube video Willowbrook. It's actually a documentary done by Geraldo years ago. But if you have a chance to look, it is so riveting. And it's exactly what it looked like when I was going into Rosewood. And I was given the task about every 3 or 4 months to go get, actually it was probably more than that, a little bit longer than that, but to go find 15 people and bring in 15 people, bring out actually 15 people out of the institution. And there were people naked, there were people screaming, there were people rocking in the corner. And it was always so hard to pick 15 people and leave the rest. And back then, you know, there were thousands. So, you know, and as we brought them out and as we helped them, we realized that how shaken up they all were. Now I know they were so traumatized. And it was a long process of trying to help them to feel safe. And that process hasn't changed, really. We continue to struggle with helping people to feel safe. So I may refer to materials, and I would just like you all to know that at karenharvey.org, my website, are free materials. I have workbooks you can use. I have happiness assessment. I have a daily assessment for, daily happiness worksheet. I have a psychological assessment. I have all kinds of things that you can peruse and use if you like, and for free. So, and I'll be talking about that. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, good. Because now I can only see me, but oh well, it doesn't matter. So seeing Rosewood and seeing all those situations were really, really riveting to me. Like, how could this be? So the first thing I want to say, and to me, the most important thing that I have to say today is thank you to all of you. Thank you, because you are the people that see those who are invisible. You are the ones that have been there, and you are the ones that continue to be there. And because of you, people don't have to live in institutions. Because of your dedication and your work and what you do day in, day out, that may not seem like a lot to you, people's lives are so much better. So thank you, thank you, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. You are the people making all the difference. And those of you who are family members, thank you as well. Thank you to all of you for hanging in there and not giving up, and especially not giving up during the time of COVID, which has been such a difficult time. And the trauma of COVID, right, has been so intense. And I want to talk about that a little bit because, you know, I started going way, way back. Okay, Rosewood, how horrible. And seeing people who were marginalized and invisible. I would love to tell you, and it's all different now, but still people are still marginalized. But what just happened? Let's jump all the way forward. And what do we see forward? A trauma in the last 2 years, 2.5 years now, right? That was unbelievable. That is historic. And that affected people with intellectual disabilities quite dramatically, as it affected us. So there was all kinds of impact from this trauma. There was big T and little t traumas. And at this point, I'd like to always take a moment because in Maryland, we lost a number of people with intellectual disabilities to COVID. People I knew, people I didn't know, people you knew. And we lost some staff. So I want to just take a moment of silence to honor the lives that we lost too soon. Thank you. Thank you so much, because that was the hardest part. And that's of course very significant trauma, the grief and the loss. We've been through, I believe there were 3 phases of mental health challenge as well. And the 3 phases for the mental health challenge was, number 1, we went through so much fear, right? Number 2 was the isolation. And then number 3, the anxiety. Anxiety and exhaustion. Anxiety and exhaustion, because that fatigue of, oh, now again, oh, we have to put the mask back on, oh, we have to get another shot. But in each phase had its mental health effects. So I was in between variants. I went to North Dakota to a big conference, and I did the opening talk, and then I was asked to do a workshop about the mental health effects of COVID on people with intellectual disabilities, right? And I was like, okay, great. Had my whole PowerPoint, had my slides prepared. And then I walk in, we're all set, and several agencies actually brought their folks. So there were people with intellectual disabilities in the workshop. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to talk about them with them here. This doesn't seem kosher. I'm not going to do that, you know, but what I want to do is talk with them. And that was probably one of the most riveting and best workshops that I've ever had and I've ever been a part of, because they told their stories and they explained how it was for them. And it was riveting. So I would like to tell you about this one fellow His name was Philip, older gentleman. And Philip was, you could tell, a very wise old man and wanted to tell people about life and had a lot to say. And he was in a wheelchair. He had gone through a lot. He explained that he had Parkinson's now and, you know, just had been through so much. But he said, this is what happened, because we just opened up the forum for everybody to share what they went through and how it was for them. And he said, well, first, we couldn't go to the store and we had to wash our groceries. And we were washing the groceries and we were doing what we were supposed to do. And we were watching TV, and on the TV, there were people who died, and there were numbers of people who died, you know, and of course that was terrifying for all of us, but that was so scary for him. Like, there were people who died. And then he said, you know, but we stayed home and we were okay. But then John got sick. And John got sick, and John went to the hospital. And we had to put on masks when we walked around. And then most of the time we had to stay in our rooms, and we had to eat in our rooms, and we ate in our rooms, and we stayed in our rooms. So of course they were quarantining, and we couldn't do anything. But then John came home, but we had to wear masks, but we could have dinner together. But then Jimmy got sick, and Jimmy went in the hospital, and we had to go back in our rooms, and we couldn't do anything. You know, this was so many people when they got quarantined. These were so many situations. And he was in a group home setting. And then he said, but Jimmy came back. We were okay for a little while. It was a little while and we were okay. But then Linda got sick. And Linda went to the hospital, and he shook his head, but she never came back. And all of a sudden, his staff that's sitting next to him, the DSP, bursts into tears and starts sobbing. And he leans his hand over and comforts her. It's okay. It's okay. I got it then, like, oh my gosh, the impact of this pandemic. Oh my goodness. And how it affected the people that we live with and we support and who live together. You know, what an impact, how difficult. And then that isolation was so hard for so many. I was so privileged, thanks to the ARC of Central Chesapeake, to be able to conduct group therapy with 3 different groups with Cindy Lindgren and Dawn Brodeur, assistants. And we did this therapy, and it was riveting. We would talk, you know, afterwards, like, oh my gosh, can you believe it? And people talked about relatives getting sick, but they also connected to each other. They talked about being so lonely, but being so happy to see each other. And then a couple of people figured out how to run their own Zooms and started Zoom dinner parties and Zoom, I think they were doing Zoom bingo. It was amazing. And reconnecting, because so much of what they were talking about was their isolation and their loneliness. Those who with family wanting to see their friends, asking over and over again when the day program was opening up. And those who were, you know, in their ALUs or group homes, they didn't have group home settings, but in their residential settings, wanting to know when they could see their family and if they're, you know, just worrying about everybody. So this has really taken such a toll. And now as we come out of this, we have to understand that people are affected. People are, and you could probably tell me more about how people are affected, but I am a therapist, and as a psychologist, I do therapy with folks with intellectual disabilities, and everybody on my caseload has been so affected. And some are not going back to their programs because they don't want to, and they're feeling anxious, and they were told before that they could get sick, and that's why they weren't going to the program. So now they don't want to go. You know, they're cocooning kind of in a safe space. And it's been very, very difficult. So people need a little bit of extra support now. You know, they need this guidance, they need this help, they need this reassurance. We all do, right? We all do, because of what we've been through and because of what they've been through. And what I find as I do therapy with people, and still, you know, there's holes, there's gaps in understanding, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, and we're dealing with this reality. It's a reality. In general, trauma is the elephant in the room with folks with disabilities. And as I was telling you, I just had so many people that when I was back starting that therapy, so many people that shared incidents of sexual abuse, incidents of physical abuse, but so much sexual abuse that it was really horrifying. And since then, we've learned a lot, right? Gabor Mate says, trauma is not what happened to you, it's how what happened to you made you feel. And so many people were so traumatized, even by the smaller traumas that they went through, let alone the bigger traumas. And many of those traumas were related to how they were interacting in the world, ways that they tried to protect themselves with their behavior, right? So some of the sources of trauma for people with intellectual disabilities was so much of that sexual abuse. We now know. There's in 2018, Joe Shapiro did a very thorough report, and it took weeks, and it was really amazing, on the sexual abuse of people with intellectual disabilities. He interviewed a number of people who had been sexually abused, who had experienced all kinds of abuse. And there was story after story. And I was fortunate enough to meet him and be interviewed as somebody who does therapy with folks who have been sexually abused. And along with Nora Baladarian, who's done a lot of work in that area. And he told us how he went to the Bureau of Statistics and asked them to print a report about, you know, of all the reports nationwide of people who have been sexually abused with intellectual disabilities versus without. And they came back to him and said, people with intellectual disabilities are 7 times more likely to be sexually abused. And then as we talked, we all knew that was a very low number. It's probably closer to 10 times, because those were only the reports that were received through the criminal justice system, right? Those were the police reports that were filed. Things aren't always reported. And not only reported, and they didn't include the reporting stream through provider agencies. So much sexual abuse. And when I'm in person, which I miss, but I'm also really grateful for the opportunity that we didn't have to stop, and we could keep going and talk about these things and get the message out. But when I'm in person, I always ask people, how many of you know somebody with a history of sexual abuse, who's been sexually abused, who has an intellectual disabilities? And every time, 2/3 of the room raise their hands. Every single time. Every single time. So much trauma, so much abuse, and it's like an epidemic. Physical abuse, bullying, so much bullying. I've seen so many people bullied and people re-experiencing the trauma of bullying. I believe many people that I've worked with have had post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of being bullied. And it's really tough. It's a reality that's really harsh. If you remember, and I hate to bring this up, but middle school or junior high, maybe was there someone who bullied you? If you're a girl, there definitely probably was, because there were so many mean girls, right? The mean girls were everywhere. And I had a girl who used to grab my hair when I was in the hallway, and she would grab my hair and show it to her friends, and they'd all go, ooh, gross, because split ends were a big deal in the 70s. Well, what are you going to do? I got a haircut. It didn't help. They found something else. We all know about the mean girls. They're there. But now, you remember something? I have some good news. All those bullies, they peaked in high school. It's over for them. They're sitting on the couch drinking beer, talking about how great they were as a football player or whatever. They were the cutest cheerleader. It's over. And they're going downhill. Now, you all are wonderful humanists who even care about trauma and people with intellectual disabilities, who do so much for people. Yeah. Listen, you think I'm wrong? Go to your high school reunion. That'll prove it. But the bullying went on. Now I'm going to ask you, how many of you remember somebody in your class with an intellectual disability? What did they go through on a daily basis? How often were they bullied or picked on, right? And how did it affect them? So I remember about 5 years ago, no, now it's probably about 6 years ago, when I was at a job where I was doing a lot of grief counseling, and my whole staff, we were doing a lot of grief work with people, because what we realized is that people with intellectual disabilities are very traumatized through loss, because there's so few people in their lives. I mean, we all know people, right, who are very, are grieving 20 years later, or maybe they're devastated because their staff left. There's so much grief. There's so much grief. So I've, throughout many years, I've done a lot of grief counseling. On that website that I showed you, KarenHarvey.org, we have something called the Goodbye Book, which has really helped people through the years, where they can just do a workbook, a little beautiful book dedicated to the person that they lost, and celebrate also who they were to that person, and the fact that they're a valuable person themselves, and also show their love for the person they lost. I've had people do it when they have had staff who have left as well, the Goodbye Book. So we were doing this, this goodbye and grief, Goodbye Book and grief work with my wonderful staff. And this one guy was really having a hard time, and he could not get over the bullying. And this fantastic therapist was working with him, who was doing a really good job. But she said, I think we need to do more trauma work. We're doing the grief work, and it's great. And the grief is trauma, right? Don't get me wrong, it's all trauma. But she asked me to do EMDR, because that's what I do. And it's an intensified trauma therapy, which she now does. She got trained in it, and she's currently doing it. But she's like, can you do EMDR with him? Because he's so stuck on the bullying that happened to him, and his father had died, and what he can't really get past is or what he's working on, we'll put it that way, is trying to forgive his father for the way that his father was connected to the bullying. So I'm like, okay, this sounds interesting. What is this? Sure, I'll do whatever. So I meet this fellow, and listen to this. He was told by his family, and this has happened to many, many people. Of course, people are still hearing this, but he was told back then, it was maybe, you know, I guess he was in his 50s, so it was a while ago. And when he was an adolescent, he was told, you will never marry, you will not go to college, you are not going to get a good job like your brothers and sisters are probably going to get, and you won't be able to have kids. And all he ever wanted was kids, and he wanted a family so badly. And it shattered him to hear this, right? And so he did a really smart thing. He came up with an imaginary wife and imaginary kids. I think that's really smart, right? So he had his imaginary wife and his imaginary kids, and he would, unfortunately, he brought them to school every day. And he used to sit in the front, but then he moved to the back, and because he had to have empty seats so that the kids could sit there, and his wife. And then sometimes he'd say, sit back down, you know, you got to listen. And the teacher went off on him. She said, stop that right now. And then she made fun of him in front of the other kids. And then she went to the principal and said, this kid is too disabled to be in my class. here's the story. They were a special ed class that went all the way from kindergarten up to high school together. So they were somewhat integrated, right? That's a questionably integrated situation, but they were the special ed class in the school. And so they all were very close. They knew each other. They'd been together all these years. These were his friends. And this teacher mocked him repeatedly in front of his friends, and then went to the principal and said he was too disabled and needed to go to the special school where most of the children were very medically involved, and very few were speaking, and where they didn't really learn much. And this guy was really smart and read and wrote and tried very hard every day. And his parents were brought in, and the teacher said, your son has a very severe disability. He does not belong in this class. He can't keep up. He's got an imaginary wife and kids. This is ridiculous. He belongs with the very disabled. And they put him in that school. And he lost his friends. He was bullied by this teacher repeatedly until he left. And then there was nothing to do there for 2 more years. Spent the rest of high school there. And when his father died, his biggest problem was forgiving him. So we did the EMDR and really processed this. And then he wrote this beautiful letter to his father and a letter to his brothers, explaining it, because the brothers never really understood what happened. And it really helped him a lot. But that therapy was so important, and he needed both ends of it. He needed the grief work with the first therapist, and then he needed that really deep trauma support, to really work through that trauma. And all to his credit, he graduated and he got a job, and he had worked at that job for 20 years. And he would do a beautiful thing that always moved me so much after I knew his story, is he would have parties. He had his own apartment with staff support, and he would have parties, I think at least 2 times a year. I know he had a Halloween party and a Christmas party, and he might have had a third, but he would, with those same friends that he was in that class with. So he got his life back together, and he put piece to piece back together and healed through having that job that really gave him so much pride, and through his friends, which is how people heal. We heal through relationships and friendships, and we heal by having purpose and meaning and mission, right? But then that one just knife in his heart from his father and mother going along with the teacher, he had to resolve, and it all came to a head after his father's death. So much trauma for people with disabilities, so much bullying went on. Unless you were raised in a bubble, if you had an intellectual disability, you were called the R word. You were picked on, you were laughed at. So now, do you remember somebody in your class or school with an intellectual disability and what they went through on a daily basis? What was life like for them? Right? So hard. Being excluded, very difficult. Studies show that exclusion actually causes physical pain. To be left out and excluded, your body responds, your brain starts flashing in your pain center. And our folks have been excluded so much, from so much. And then, of course, the institutionalization. And that's a very severe reality, a very severe reality. And for those of you who work with people who were in the institution back in the day, it's as though they are Holocaust survivors. Of course, Holocaust was worse, don't get me wrong, but this was similar. And there were many deaths. There were many things that shouldn't have happened. And people saw horrific things. And people came out traumatized. So if you work with somebody who's older, who has that history, that is what they carry with them. And they're heroes, they're survivors. They're amazing, just that they could keep going. I don't know that I could. I don't know that I could have, really. An important point is we know about the big trauma, right? So if someone was in the institution and we know it was really bad there, we know they had a big T trauma. But then the little T traumas of life, like that bullying, like being excluded, like being laughed at, just little things. Francine Shapiro was able to show with her work and her research that the little traumas actually can also cause post-traumatic stress disorder. So we may say, well, this person really hadn't been through too much, or this person has got a nice family, so they're fine. We don't know what we don't know. And often we're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder without even realizing it. And it's very, very frequent in the world of intellectual disabilities, where there was so much bullying, where there was so much exclusion, where I don't know if any of you work with people who've had repeated foster care placements. Very traumatizing. I don't care what was going on, often horrible things are going on, but very rarely is the child happy to be taken out of their home. And very rarely are they immediately placed in a very stable, nurturing, and supportive environment. Oftentimes there's several placements. Sometimes there's several placements and then a residential placement. And if those are your formative years, right? So just multiple placements is trauma. Right? So a lot of times we're looking at something that we don't realize we're seeing, but once you put on those trauma glasses, you start to see it everywhere, and it explains so much. It explains why people are so defensive. It might explain aggression. 99% of the aggression I've seen is actually because people were afraid. That aggression was out of fear. That wasn't a deliberate attempt to hurt someone, because the best defense is a good offense. So all the protective behaviors where people are trying to protect themselves are based on trauma, right? So when you've had a lot of trauma, the most important thing becomes staying safe. And you're constantly asking yourself, am I safe? How can I get safe? Is this person safe? Do they care about me? Are they kind? Am I going to be okay? Right? And if you had a history of being bullied, then you're wondering who's kind and who's going to turn on me, right? Because this is past trauma that gets triggered. And I would hope, let's see if I can show this video. Hopefully I can. This is from Love on the Spectrum. And uh-oh, no sound. Okay. Do you hear that? You probably don't, right? Okay.
I don't hear sound.
Yeah, I don't know why. Let me see. There's always something.
It could be a bandwidth issue.
All right, we will try again. Do you see me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's good.
Do you want to share the link?
Here because I just, yeah, that's a great idea. And maybe what we'll do is we'll take a break at 11 and I can share the link then, but I'm just going to recommend it and I'm going to distribute it. Or what I'll do is I'll act it out for you. Okay, let me see, share. Sorry about that. I don't know why there's no sound. Okay. And we'll take a break, and maybe after the break we can try showing it and I will share it with Donna at that point. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides and I'm just going to tell you that it just shows how everybody has been bullied and the reality of the fact that these are people. Love on the Spectrum shows us people who have really a lot of privilege, right? The first few seasons were in Australia, and they had beautiful homes and they had families who cared about them, and they all still share their experience of being bullied, which if we can't show you, we'll share you the link if we can't show it to you. I think I might give up on trying to share from here. So the trauma of loneliness. David Petoniak says that in the world of intellectual disabilities, and he's a brilliant neuropsychologist that probably many of you have heard speak, and he says in the world of intellectual disabilities, loneliness is the biggest problem. And loneliness is its own kind of trauma, isn't it? Maybe a little T trauma, but it adds up to become a big T. Our brain is wired for interaction. A lot of research in the neuropsychological world has showed us that how much the brain really needs to have relationships and just needs social interaction. So Lieberman did a study that showed, he looked at the brain, and you know, sometimes they'll watch the brain as somebody does something, like someone will do a puzzle and the brain will light up in one little area. Oh, that's your, you know, spatial reasoning or whatever. But there are only two things that the brain completely lights up for. The first is to meet a physical need. So you're hungry and you're going to get some food, right? Your brain lights up there. And then the second is to seek social interaction. That's how much humans need interaction. The whole brain will focus and light up when there's another person, when there's an interaction. Doesn't mean you always want it, but you focus on it because that's what we are wired for. Otherwise, we would have just died out as cavemen. We would have looked at each other and said, you're crazy. I'm going back to my cave and nothing, you know, no procreating. And then Eisenberger did this study where she had people, and it seems like a silly study, but it's a very important study. She had people in a room, she had participants, and she's a professor, so she used probably Psych 101 students who had to be in a study in order to get their credit. And she told them that they were playing cyberball with a mouse to catch on their computer, to catch a ball and do it as fast as they can and work together, and with two other people in two other rooms. But really, there were actually just, it was a software program that would, for the first 5 minutes, it threw the ball to the participant. But then after that, it excluded the participant for like another 15, 20 minutes. So the person would not get the ball and the other two would just throw the ball between them. And they weren't really real people. And they had participants' brains, you know, wired up to see where it would flash, where the brain was flashing. Every single participant, every single one, their brain flashed in the pain center. Singular anterior cortex. Same place if you broke your foot that your brain would be flashing at. Ouch, pain center. So being excluded, even in something silly, caused pain. And at the time I thought, well, you know, this is a little silly. Maybe it's just a bunch of freshmen who really miss their mothers. And no, that was not the case. It turned out that some very together people were very frustrated by this. How do I know? The universe gave me a gift. Here's what happened. For about 7 years, I taught at University of Baltimore in just adjunct. I taught the psychology of trauma for the graduate school. And I would talk about this, you know, and the effect of being excluded. And I had a kid in my class who was the most popular kid, you know, the one guy in the class full of women, and lacrosse player, had gone to Duke University where they replicated the study. And he said, oh my God, I was in that study. So I knew that that was probably true. He's like, it was horrible. I said, come on, you just, really? Because you just didn't catch a ball? He's like, no, you don't understand. It was so frustrating. That was the gift I got. So I met this person who was in it. It was a very together, confident person who told me how frustrated he was. Any exclusion causes a sense of pain, right? And we all know that. You think about the wedding you weren't invited to. My cousin didn't invite me to her wedding. I was shocked, I was hurt, and then I didn't invite her to mine. You know how it goes. But how many times are people with intellectual disabilities excluded? How many of you know someone that wasn't invited to a funeral or a wedding in their own family? These things have happened for years. The exclusion is profound and it creates physical pain. A little bit of neuropsychological gossip, these two hooked up and ended up getting married. I love that. Read it in Rolling Stone. True. You can read a lot in Rolling Stone magazine. So post-traumatic stress disorder is on a continuum, right? It's not just a on or off switch. There can be all different degrees of PTSD. And that's one thing I've come to see through the years as I work with many people. I would see that they were triggered by something, or that they would get very, very upset about some very small issue. And for a long time, I just looked at it as a behavioral issue. But I finally started seeing the trauma everywhere, and that these were trauma responses. You know, the act of betrayal also traumatizes us. Bruce Perry is a wonderful, wonderful psychiatrist who has written a lot about trauma. And I highly recommend his latest book. He did it with Oprah, called What Happened to You. It's a wonderful read. And if you read it in the audiobook, they both talk. And he talks a lot about the act of being betrayed as trauma. And this lovely young woman asked me to tell her story. I did crisis counseling after there was a sexual assault. And she got alone time. And what happened was, I believe, I blame myself because I had worked in the agency where she was. And I knew, and we all knew, that the one thing she wanted more than anything in the world was a boyfriend. And we, at the, her yearly meeting, we'd talk about, we'd say, what do you want? What are your goals? We had person-centered meeting. I want a boyfriend. She had a certain guy she wanted to be with, but his mother had shut it all down. And I was running a singles group at the time. We could have really helped her, but her staff would always say, "Oh, my ladies don't want to go, or my people don't want to go. We're not going." And I was not smart enough to realize that the other two older women didn't want to go, but that I should have helped her and I should have tried harder. And when she got alone time, she started walking every day in the afternoon, and a man started grooming her. And he told her he would give her a ride to the dollar store, and then he told her he would be her boyfriend. And then I'm sorry, this is a little bit upsetting. I should have given a warning earlier, but some of the stories I say are upsetting. He raped her, and thank God she got back to her home safe. Thank goodness. And they did everything right, got her to the hospital. They did the same, and they were able to identify who he was. And he got arrested, put in jail. And by then I had left, and I was working in a clinic, and she was referred to me, since we already knew each other, for the crisis counseling. I do more than I wish crisis counseling. I would like to do more prevention counseling, but I do so much after the fact. And she was so hurt by the fact that he wasn't her boyfriend. And I can name 10 people where I did the crisis counseling afterwards, or else I supervised the person doing it. And the most devastating piece was that betrayal. I mean, yes, the sexual assault was horrible, terrible, not forgivable, but the betrayal was the worst part. And if we really worked harder, if I had worked harder to help people have relationships, have real relationships where they, are fulfilled, and they're with people who want to be with them, and it's consenting, and we wouldn't have as much of this problem, because people wouldn't be so wide open for this, because they wouldn't be looking for that relationship. So if she had had a boyfriend, if we had helped her to move on past this person whose mother didn't want them to be together, and helped her to meet new people and find someone, and given her those social opportunities and supported her in developing the social skills, this guy would have said, "Can I give you a ride?" And she would have said, "No, I got a boyfriend." Or even if she took that one ride, he said, "I want to be your boyfriend," she would have said, "I've got a boyfriend." So part of protecting people is helping them to have full and real lives with relationships. not so likely to be betrayed. So I'm going to tell this story real quickly, and then, or actually this isn't a story, this is a study. Very important though, about neglect. How many of you have worked with somebody that has a history of neglect? Where maybe they were born into a chaotic situation where there was a lot of drug or alcohol abuse, right? Maybe there was all kinds of effects from that, and big piece of that being neglect. We've only just recently started looking at the effects of neglect. A wonderful researcher, Nathan Cox, went to Romania and to an orphanage, and he divided the kids in the orphanage into two, just randomly picked them, and they were from 6 months old to 4.5. So already they'd experienced much trauma. Already there was a lot of damage. But he put half of them in a very nurturing foster care setting. And here's the results. After 5 years, the children in the institution, 55% had some kind of thought or mood disorder, and it was down to 35%, those in foster care. Emotional disorders, 49% down to 29%. In the third column are children raised in their biological home. Behavioral disorders, 32% to 25%. Smaller difference because a lot of people just shut down. And then here's a really important statistic for us, and that is the average IQ. The average IQ of those children left in the orphanage where they were neglected, they didn't get a lot of nurturing, there wasn't a lot of stimulation, was 73 versus 85, a 12-point difference, right? And then 110, those children raised in their biological homes. 12-point increase after getting nurtured. That's something Bruce Perry writes about as well in another good book. He should be paying me something for promoting all his books, right? The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, which shows us the importance of nurturing. It's a very big piece. And it continues to help people in adulthood. I bet all of you know somebody who, once they got into a stable residential situation where they got nurtured, where they were encouraged, where they were treated with respect, they started to do better. They started to be able to function better cognitively. They started to make more connections, and they moved forward. And oftentimes those behavioral issues abate because they feel safe and they're nurtured. Very important. Sadly, those children who were left in the institution, Nathan Fox saw the gray matter in their brain actually shrunk. So being neglected is physiologically damaging. You have less gray matter in your brain. You have higher brain, you have lower brain activity, but higher amounts of adrenaline and cortisol. And then there were more deaths as well. So the premature deaths were high. When we found that out at the turn of the century in the 1900s, they had orphanages where they thought the best thing was to keep children safe. And so people would handle them with gloves, and they would never hold them. They wouldn't cuddle them. They wouldn't do anything to nurture. They would be as sanitary as they could. And babies actually died. That's when the phenomenon of failure to thrive syndrome became known. Babies need nurturing, they need support. And our brain works that there's critical developmental periods in which we need certain stimulation to develop normally and to be able to get wired. I always ask at this point, how many of you know somebody with an intellectual disability who's really, really smart, but they scored lower than 72 on or 72 or lower on an IQ test? At this point, everybody, there's usually, again, 2/3 of the people will say, I know. And then I ask you, now that you're thinking of someone, do they have a trauma history? The answer is always yes. So we learn about trauma. We see trauma everywhere. And I think there's more trauma in the world of intellectual disabilities than anywhere. And it's complex trauma, which means it's layer after layer. It's not just a single event. So why don't we take a 5-minute break? Sorry, I went a little over. And we'll figure out, come back in 5 minutes, and we'll at least have a link for you for some of the YouTube videos. Thanks. Hi there. Okay, I should show my screen. Well, I hate to stop showing my screen. But Donna, should I email that link to you?
I have it in my drive and I shared it with everyone.
Oh, good.
It's
I
the
don't know
one.
why the sound isn't working.
Someone suggested that you click on the sound, like the sound first, and then bring up the video. But I can try to bring it up as well.
It's not that important, but you know, do you have being an unperson?
I have Born This Way, Listen, Willowbrook. No.
Okay.
Being an unperson, I don't have that one.
Okay. Let's try. Let's play. Do I have a minute to play?
Yeah, everyone can hear, but it's
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry,
But
guys.
hopefully people are out, taking care of business. And not thinking stay for the break part.
We're still recording too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do we have messages? Oh, here's my other question. Are you going to be here for the whole thing?
Yes, today, yes. Tomorrow, someone else will be finishing up. Caroline.
Oh, great. Do you mind reading the questions to me?
Yeah. Hang on just a second.
Or whatever comments you think, and you can screen through them.
I'm gonna put them in chat for you so that you can. Would that be all right?
Okay, thanks. Sure. Because I can open that up, right?
Yeah. I think we only
I don't know why things aren't. I knew things. Actually, for some reason, I can't open the chat.
Huh. Go to the file up on the top. I'll tell you what. I'll just I'll change your status to organizer, and then you'll be able to open up. Hopefully, the panel will readjust for you.
Okay, thanks. You know, I'm just going to go on, and I'm just not going to show videos.
Oh,
I
you
think
should be
that's
able to see the
easier.
questions. Okay, I'm seeing that you're an organizer, so you should be able to open up and see questions.
Oh, here it is. Click to read your unread chat. Okay. Neighborhood violence, yes. Okay, I see one. Oh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I'm going to just skip all the videos. It's just easier.
And in the follow-up email, I can send the links that you want me to. It goes to all the people that participated and all the people that registered, so they can review them at their own in their own time.
That's nice. Thank you. And maybe tomorrow I'll practice. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to roll. You think everybody's back?
We don't really know. I mean, we could ask people to like.
It's all right. No,
That would be a bit much.
you know what? I'm not going to worry. I'm just going to talk and I'm going to tell stories, and then we'll leave some time for questions. And now I see where I can read the chat. Click to open up the question panel. I don't know if I can. Okay, this will. Okay. Now, do you see my panel when you see my screen?
I see the your screen, which is the has the words on the left and the picture on on the right side, and then also we see your video on top, and when the interpreters come back, they'll be on the right side.
Oh, okay, well that's when we should start, is when they come back, right?
Yeah. Did we give them 10 minutes? Like, did we break from 11 to 11:10? Oh,
That's
it was
okay.
5 minutes. Okay.
10 is, we just want people to be happy. I'm saying such depressing things.
Yeah.
The videos are so depressing. But so I'll tell you what. Oh, that's right. You're not going to be here for the whole time.
Oh, she's back.
I was gonna say,
Elena's back. Thank you.
oh, great. So I was going to say we can show some of these videos tomorrow.
Okay.
And I'll email them to you, the one that you don't have.
Okay. And I'll share them with Caroline. Perfect.
Great. So much. Okay. I love it. All right, guys, we're back. We're back. Thank you so much. And, you know, as we're talking, think about specific people that you're working with, people who may have been born into situations that were really tough, where there was chaos, where they were neglected, because you need interaction for your brain to get wired up properly. We have mirror neurons. It's actually controversial whether there's a neuron, a brain cell, that is a mirror that mirrors, or if it's a function that several brain cells work together. But one thing we know is that when you are at critical developmental periods, you need to be interacted with in order for your brain to get wired properly. So that's why, if you've ever seen these stories of a child who was raised by wolves and they walk on all fours like a wolf and they howl, because at their critical developmental period, they heard howling, so they learned to howl. They saw someone walking on all fours as their brain was getting wired. So they got wired up to, even though they're human, to act like a wolf. And so babies need that stimulation. They need to hear language. They need to see smiles. They need to have connections. And when that doesn't happen at critical times, the brain doesn't get wired properly. Thinking about people you know, people born into where there was maybe a lot of drug use or drug and alcohol use. I have worked with so many people who would have been so smart. And the other problem, you know, they didn't get that interaction at those critical developmental periods. And also they were, in many cases, they were exposed in utero, right? So I worked with one woman who gave me permission to tell her story, which is quite a story, because her mother was locked up while pregnant for drugs and drug usage. What kind of world do we live in? And then she had the baby in jail, and the baby, along with her son, were given to her sister. I think her sister already had the son, who was about a year old, and then the baby was born maybe a year and a half. And the baby was born and given to the sister. The baby cried a lot. The sister shook the baby, and the baby had shaken baby syndrome. And this woman is legally blind as a result, and has a pretty mild intellectual disability, but was exposed to drugs in utero, as well as had shaken baby syndrome. This is a person who would not have had anything otherwise, and went through so much. Eventually, good part of the story is that eventually the mother was able to stop using, and she was reunited with her mother and back in the family home. But the kind of damage that's done on so many different levels, it's just extraordinary once you start hearing stories, right? People that would have been okay. And then what happens when there's that drug and alcohol exposure? I'm sure many of you have seen people with fetal alcohol, have had trainings about fetal alcohol. But what's really important is that we look at fetal alcohol and the effects of it, as well as its interaction with drugs. Meaning, what happened to you when you were in the room? What happened to you? And trauma with many of the people we support started before birth. I just read an article yesterday that babies of mothers where there wasn't any alcohol or drug exposure, but the mothers were pregnant and they were in 9/11 and they survived. And their babies had the same level, low levels of cortisol indicating high trauma response. So that in utero, they were affected. Well, now when there's drug exposure or alcohol exposure on top of that, it's so much. So what we know about fetal alcohol syndrome is that it really impacts your ability to to sequentially reason. So cause and effect, you can't connect. When you've had that alcohol damages your understanding. If I tell you all A equals B and B equals C, you will all know that A equals C. But somebody with fetal alcohol syndrome has problems reasoning through that and following a reasoning line, right? A linear reasoning line. And so they can't understand cause and effect. 99% of the behavior plans I wrote were based on understanding cause and effect. If you do this, you'll get that. If you don't do that, you won't get your reward, blah, blah, blah. And I wrote plans for people with fetal alcohol syndrome that were ineffective because I didn't understand the effects of their actual brain damage. On top of that, sometimes there's been drug exposure and different drugs have different effects, but we know there was a period through late 80s and throughout the 90s where there were high levels of infants born addicted to cocaine. And what does the cocaine do? It creates impulse control problems. People go from 0 to 100 like that. And they have severe attention deficit disorder, a real inability to focus. So now imagine if there was drug and alcohol exposure. There's an inability to connect cause and effect. There's explosiveness or impulse control. Sometimes they run away. You don't know what just happened, but very smart because other parts of the brain aren't damaged. So often people can read, they can write, they know what they want, but they can't execute it because they also have that severe attention deficit, real inability to finish a sentence, not just a little vagueness. So we're often working with people that have had this in utero trauma that we may not realize. And we may see that they're smart because they're speaking and they're articulating things, but they're not always understanding that they can act like they know. And then they may set themselves up. They may get themselves into certain situations. I know I work with a number of people who got involved in gangs because they wanted so much to be accepted, to be included, because of that history of exclusion. And they were always the fall guy. There was one period I worked at an agency that was so wonderful. We were taking person after person out of jail and really supporting them, and people were flourishing, but they were often in jail because they were the ones told to stand here and look out for the cops or do this, set up. And they just wanted to be a part of something, you know, because they had been excluded because of their intellectual disability, which was often as a result of drug and alcohol exposure. So there's so many levels of trauma that people have endured, physical and emotional. We have to see what we have to see, you know, and we may not always know the trauma. We may not always be able to assess trauma. So my encouragement is let's worry less about assessment and assume it. Assume trauma. because people have been through so much. And as we start thinking about their histories, we may not know everything, but what we do know can inform us that this person has been through a lot. Rather than getting the details of the story, that's not what we need in order to help them to heal. What we need in order to help them to heal are ways to help people to feel safe, to be nurtured, to feel cared about, and to be a part of things, to be included. Inclusion on every level. Real inclusion. Not just driving around in a van, going to the 7-Eleven and say you were in the community that day, but really being a part of it, which is very challenging, but we've got to figure it out because that's what heals people. So at this point, I'd like to talk about the brain because this really helps us to understand. So you have, and probably a lot of you have heard this, our brain was wired for survival, right? When we were in the jungle, it was really important that we be able to respond quickly to danger, right? So let's say we were a bunch of cavemen and we're hanging out and life is good because we caught an antelope. That was hard. And we're having an antelope roast because we figured out how to do fire because we're really smart. And the kids are running around, we're having a barbecue, it's a great day. And all of a sudden this furry thing comes up. And we look and say, oh, what's that furry thing? And then the furry thing runs up and eats Susie. Oh no! We gotta respond right away. We gotta get the rest of the kids and hide them and run, or somebody may wanna try to attack him. And the part of our brain that's yellow takes a picture of that furry thing because it stores the thing called the amygdala, stores all the danger symbols, right? Signals, and pictures. Our brain stem just basically keeps the brain going, but the yellow part is what we needed to survive when we were cavemen. And it has that amygdala, which will take pictures of anything dangerous or very important. It's what we call the emotional memory or the implicit memory. And it will release chemicals into the brain so that you can run faster or fight harder. And it activates that fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And then there's another part in the limbic system that's the cool down system, the parasympathetic nervous system. So we have the sympathetic nervous system where that amygdala is. Basically what we have is the activation, oh my God, we're in danger part. And then we have, okay, the danger is gone and calm down part, all in the yellow part of the brain, right? Then we have our smart brain, the neocortex. And that's where we have our executive functioning. That's where we plan and we think things out and we figure things out and we analyze and we think about what we should be doing next and, right, we problem solve. So, but with planning and organization. So we see that lion and we're running. Oh, we come up with a name for it too. It's a lion. 3 weeks later, we're back out in the field and we have a boar. Yay! And it's a wild boar roast. Good times, good times. I mean, we miss Susie, but other than that, everything's going great. And then we see another furry thing. Rather than needing our smart brain, because our smart brain might say, oh, is that the same lion? Are those the same stripes? Is that a relative maybe? Or is that a different one? No. There's no time to analyze. So what happens is when your yellow part of the brain, when the limbic system sees danger, it takes over and the green part of the brain shuts down, right? So then all of a sudden you're just like responding, right? And you just have to, so then the ones who got the sticks and stones go and try and kill the lion, the fighters, the runners run away. Maybe a little tiny caveman will play dead because we're the only animal that eats dead animals. We got the Food Network, we figured it all out, we're brilliant. But we all respond to the danger. And our smart brain, analyzing things and thinking things out, stops. But now let's fast forward to modern life. And here we are, and our brain is the same way. And we are not in the jungle. So sometimes it's not the best thing to fight someone or run away or freeze, but these are still our trauma responses. And I wrote some really bad behavior plans. I apologize to those of you out there who ever had to look at them or be trained in them, because I wrote plans that would tell people about their smart brain. So this one fellow, his name was Dan, he came out of Rosewood. He was in Rosewood for 40 years. Actually, he was there for 38 years because he went in as a 2-year-old and he came out at 40. And he was very shaky. He had a kind of a shell-shocked look all the time. But he was happy to be at the day program and happy that he had a resident. He was in an ALU and he was so grateful. But once every 2 or 3 weeks, he would just flip out for no reason that we could figure out, right? He would start throwing chairs and screaming and attacking people, like just with by accident, because he was throwing so many things. And screaming, like he maybe used about 10 words, didn't speak much, but all of a sudden he's screaming. But he could communicate with us with those words, and we were always listening. So we couldn't figure it out. Like, this behavior isn't communicating. He's not trying to communicate something. It's accidental communication because he's showing us he's freaked out, but it's not why he's doing it. He's not doing it for attention because he gets a lot of attention. He's not doing it to escape in a demand because we're not making any demands. He's not doing it because he's bored because, you know, we have like activities that he likes, but all of a sudden he loses it. What is going on? What is going on? We finally figured it out. It was every time the program manager walked into the room, which was crazy, right? We're like, which I'm sorry, I use that word, I try not to use it, but it was very odd. But then we realized it's every time Donna comes in the room, he flips out. And Donna was very tall with straight blonde hair. And we just had to conclude that somebody with straight blonde hair, who was probably tall, had done something horrible to him, or was there when something was horrible, because his limbic system, that yellow part of his brain, and specifically the emotional memory, the amygdala, was flashing danger signals. And I wrote a behavior plan that said, when he starts to throw the chair, tell him he'll lose his soda. And he's like, I lose my soda. And then he would just throw the chairs more because he really needed the soda to calm him down. There was nothing to look forward to after that. And I'm trying to appeal, telling the staff, setting the staff up basically to appeal to the smart part of the brain. But that smart part of the brain goes offline when you're in danger. And that woman, Donna, represented danger to him. And this happens a lot where people are responding to a danger that we don't see, and we may never know the story. That's okay. We don't have to know the story. It's okay. What we have to know is that it's a trauma response and that person's triggered, and we have to make sure that we take those triggers away. We have to make sure that they're in a safe environment. So we had to change our program so that he would never see the program manager. We had to make sure that he felt safe. And what was funny is they had an old intercom system there, and she would talk to him on the intercom, and they would talk and talk because it wasn't her. It was something she triggered in him, somebody she looked like. I had a very sad session yesterday. It was a phone session because the person I'm working with injured herself. So I'm unable to be with her in person, although we have done that. And hopefully getting back to it. And of course, during COVID, when it was really bad, we only had phone sessions as well because she couldn't really Zoom. And she had a horrible sexual assault years ago, which really hurt her very much emotionally and physically. So in so many ways, she was given an STD that doesn't go away. She was devastated emotionally, and she was unable to report it in a way that they were able to catch him. So he never got caught. And she told me how she was sure she saw that person, and he saw her and ran away. And she was so triggered and so upset because she knew he was out there, and because her mother, who has since passed, had said, one day you're going to run into him because you weren't able to identify him because he's free. And she was so triggered and so upset. We're going to talk again today. But it's really clear to me that it wasn't that person, because she said it was him, and that was 20 years ago, and I'm sure the person looks very different. And I'm sure the person probably was just running, but it was such a trigger to her. And it's going to take a while. So sometimes people see someone that reminds them of someone, and when she has an intellectual disability, and I'm not going to argue with her that it wasn't him, because that part of the brain is not rational anyway. I just have to figure out how to help her feel safe. So for a while, we're going to have to talk every day. We're going to figure out other things that make her feel safe. Try to get staff over there that make her feel safe, because she's been triggered. So we might be working with people, and all of a sudden a new behavior starts, and we don't know why. And it's actually because they have been triggered, and their amygdala is telling them they're in danger because something looks like or feels like something that was dangerous in the past. I think I saw a lion, right? So now I'm fighting, and now I'm freezing, and now I'm not talking to anyone, or now I'm running away. Happens more than we think. So some of these trauma responses, we see this fight, flight, or freeze. We see what happens when someone's triggered. Everybody has their own tendencies. Some people are fighters, and they're fighting because they're afraid and they're trying to protect themselves. That's all the aggression I see. Some people are really just trying to get away, and we might be saying that they're trying to escape out of doing something, but they're not feeling safe. And often I see many people frozen. I've seen so many people just shut down and frozen because they are in a trauma mode, like something bad is going to happen to me any minute. I've seen so many people at day programs where we didn't think that they were speaking, and all of a sudden they started speaking. That's when they finally felt safe. Sometimes they start cursing, which is kind of fun, but they finally felt safe, right? And then Janina Fisher says, attachment issues come up. How many of you know someone who talks about all the time, like, I need you, I need you. Maybe something happens and they become very clingy. Maybe they call you 20 times a day. Maybe they have to talk to you and everything is an emergency. I just got 2 calls on my phone while we're sitting here from somebody who's constantly triggered and then becomes very needy. This happened, I need to talk to you. And it's a very small thing, but to him it's so big, right? So the neediness comes up, and also shame can come up. Oh, I'm a bad person. Many people say, I'm sorry, repeatedly apologize, because shame is the core of trauma, right? That's really tough. The amygdala actually becomes enlarged when people have had a lot of trauma. So there was a study done in war-torn Bosnia, those children that grew up throughout the war, they looked at their brains. They had enlarged amygdalas where they saw their houses burning down and people killed. Their amygdalas were enlarged, and the hippocampus, the working memory, was shrunk. So much smaller. You need your working memory. That's the hippocampus. That's how you learn. But the amygdala, the emotional memory that just sends out these danger signals or strong emotional messages, is overly big in people that have had a lot of trauma. How many of you know someone that just freaks out at the drop of a hat? They flip out because that amygdala is so easily triggered. Boom, boom, boom. What they need to do is feel safe. And I had this amazing experience. I was able to see Temple Grandin present, and she showed a slide of her brain, and she said to everybody, this is my brain. This is the brain of an autistic person. She has autism and talks about autism. And she said, see, my amygdala is enlarged and my hippocampus is shrunk. That autism is trauma, was what I saw there. That was the brain of someone who had had a lot of trauma. And if you've seen the movie Temple Grandin, you saw how bullied she was and rejected. And it doesn't seem that big because she had this supportive family, but it was giant. The bullying again and again, the rejection again and again, the struggle to understand this trauma. So I would say probably about 90% of the people with autism that we work with have a good level of trauma based on just trying to negotiate the world with sound screaming, lights flashing, not understanding what's really going on, often being bullied. Everyone I've worked with has had a certain degree of trauma. And people are marginalized. There's a wonderful person, their name, they became non-binary right before their death. Their name is Mel Baggs, and they talk about, being marginalized, and they cannot, they are non-speaking, or they were non-speaking, but could communicate with an iPad. And we will show tomorrow, I will show the video of Mel expressing what they went through in this life and how hard it was as a person with autism. So we can see a difference between trauma responses versus behavioral responses, right? A trauma response is triggered in an irrational manner. A behavioral response is something that we've always looked at as having intent. We do our functional assessment in order to determine the intent and the motivation. But sometimes that's not relevant because the person's just been triggered and that irrational amygdala is flashing and they're freaking out. So they're not getting something from this behavior, right? They're not getting anything from it. In fact, sometimes they set themselves back. And a trauma response is often followed by people apologizing over and over again. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. Not being triumphant because they got over on you. So many times people would say, oh, that person's just manipulative, when that's the last thing they were. They're just trying to protect themselves because their brain is telling them that they're unsafe. So I tell this one story. Years ago, we worked with this one woman, and she was raised in a very rural area, and her family really didn't support her very much. She had a disability, and she was pretty much ignored. And her brother began sexually abusing her. I'm sorry, again, this is a hard story. You can go watch The Third Hour of Today or Kelly and what's his name? There's always a new guy, Ryan. She's been through so many. I don't know, oh no, that's over with. You can watch The View. But that her brother sexually abused her over and over again. And then at one point he brought his friends and they gang raped her in a barn. And they were in a very rural area and they had a barn. And how horrible, right? She was already marginalized. She was already, really ignored largely by the family, not really, she wasn't really treasured. And then this happened and she burned the barn down. You know what? Good for her. Good for her. I'm not endorsing fire setting, but I'm just saying, I think I would have burned that barn down too. And she burned that barn down. And guess what? She got labeled a fire setter and she got sent to, she was in the last wave of people in Rosewood, because that's where they sent all the people who had been arrested and had forensic involvement. And she told on her brother, and family said that never happened. She lies. And there she was in Rosewood. And then our agency brought her out. I was so happy to be a part of an agency that was willing to do that. And we brought her out and we set her up. But she had a staff that often talked down to her like she was a little girl and would make fun of her. We had a behavior plan that was pretty restrictive, where we had to check for matches because of this label that she had. And I feel horrible about that because that really stigmatized her. And the staff would laugh at her and make it a joke with the other two people in the house. And we started doing therapy with her. And I was supervising the therapist, Dawn Brodeur Davis, who is a wonderful therapist, and was working with her. And Dawn said she really wants to move. She doesn't like the way she's being treated by her staff. And she really hates it there. And they all laugh at her. And it's really upsetting for her. And so we went to the boss and he's like, we can't move her. If we moved everybody that wanted to be moved, we just move people all day because everyone always wants to move. No, we can't do this. It's your behavior plan. Good to me. My behavior plan was no good, which was true. I mean, it was setting her up really. but I don't think that was what he meant, but maybe it was. But in any case, one day she just flipped out because she got made fun of one too many times. And she broke lamps, she turned tables in the living room, she trashed the living room, and she broke the brand new flat screen TV. And everyone had just gotten flat screen TVs. So that was the big thing. Oh my gosh. And guess what they did? Guess what we did, because I was a part of it? We moved her. So she's a very compassionate person. We'll call her Linda. Linda was so kind and compassionate. So Linda gathered everybody at the day program, and I saw her do this because I was at the day program one day, and she was talking to people. She was like running a workshop. And I kind of inched over and I heard her, and she said, "You want to move? Break your TV." So in the next 6 months or so, 3 TVs got broken. And guess what? Everybody got moved. Those were behavioral responses, right? Ooh, I want to move. Boom, boom, boom. I'm mad and I want to move. Boom, broke my TV. Oops, broke the TV. And they weren't cheap back then. So some responses are behavioral because people don't have a lot of power. Imagine if you kept saying you wanted to move and no one helped you, or maybe you could move yourself, but somehow you couldn't. We can do a beautiful thing if we really want to move, and if we're in a situation we want to get out of. It's called divorce. I think it's great. I believe in it. These guys, some of them have been living together for 20 years because 20 years ago they went to Fridays and said they would be happy to live together, but now they can't stand each other. And we're like, but this was your choice, remember? So when people don't have power, sometimes they resort to a behavioral response. We would benefit from listening, from being truly person-centered, from letting people have power with, rather than having others have power over them. So having some say in your own life would reduce that, but sometimes people feel like they have to do what they have to do. That's behavioral. A trauma response is quite different, and it almost never benefits you like it did by accident. It benefited Linda, but often it just creates more shame. It's emotion-based, and it doesn't move that person forward. And I've seen many, many, many trauma responses. Many, many, many. And sometimes people go back to behaviors, they resort to behaviors that protected them in the past, and they'll do it all over again. So I brought this man, William Stillman, who is a brilliant, brilliant speaker with autism, at one point to the Arc Baltimore, and we were able to bring him in and pay him, and it was so wonderful. And I was able to spend a lot of time with him, and he told me he's the person that he's like the autism whisperer. He calls himself that. He has autism, and he's often asked to consult when people don't know why a behavior is happening and what the problem is. And he'll come in and kind of figure it out. So he was telling me the story where he was asked to come in. There was this, a mother called him, actually. She said, "I've just gotten remarried. We're in a new home. I'm so happy here, but my daughter with autism, I think I'm going to have to put her in a home because this isn't working because she's smearing feces. And we have a new home, and I have a new husband, and this is a problem. But I heard that you can figure out these problems." So he came to the house, and there was an older daughter, maybe 2 years older. So like one was 15 and one was 13. And in the afternoons, the older one watched the younger one with autism. The one with autism was non-speaking. So he's with them. He's telling me the story. And he said he gets this feeling like something is really wrong. Something is wrong. Something is not right. My experience is when you get that feeling, you need to listen to that feeling. My biggest regrets in life were when I got that feeling and I said something, but then I didn't pursue it. And then it came out later that bad things were happening. And that's happened several times. And I've talked to other people who went through the same thing. Always listen to your gut. So this guy said that to me, I had to listen. wisely, he asked if he could go back in the afternoon when the older girl watched the younger one. So he went back. They said, sure. He went back and he sat with them for hours. And finally, the older girl opened up and said the stepfather was abusing her sexually and started molesting her. And he had tried to do it to the younger girl. That's when she started smearing feces. And this is brilliant. She smeared it around her doorway so that no one would come in. And sure enough, he wanted nothing to do with that. Wow, right? So oftentimes these trauma or behavioral responses, but when we see a trauma response, also sometimes people are trying to figure out how they can protect themselves because they're perceiving trauma. So they may either be triggered or they may be feeling that they're in danger and they have to do what they have to do with their behavior because they have no other tools in order to protect themselves. So if we think about people we know and things they've done, so often they're doing it because either they're freaked out or they're trying to protect themselves and using their behavior in a way to stay safe in their mind. I'm going to go briefly over. We're almost done, you guys. Almost done with the really bad stuff. And I'm going to go over the four symptom areas of PTSD. First is re-experiencing. So how many of you know somebody with a disability who talks all the time about someone who died? My mother died, my mother died, my father died. And you think, oh my God, they just died. And then you find out they died 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? But that person is in a loop. So when you have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, often the past is present. So you're re-experiencing and re-experiencing. You're in a loop where you're re-experiencing something horrible that happened. And those intrusive memories come in. Nightmares. You know, so many people I work with had nightmares about bullying that went on 20 or 30 years ago. Over and over again, they would be bullied in their dreams. I can tell many stories. Flashbacks. These are all symptoms of re-experiencing. So that fellow Dan, every time Donna came in the room, the program manager, he was right back there at Rosewood believing he was going to be attacked again. People have flashbacks. I used to say the dumbest thing. I used to say, oh, it's a behavioral seizure, because people get this glassy-eyed look and they're not present. And once they go and you can't get them back. Now I understand, no, it's a flashback. So their amygdala has put them right back into the trauma and they're re-experiencing it. And what we need to do is help people to feel safe. Avoidance. So we see people where they will do anything to stay safe. I've often seen people with autism resort to repeated rituals in order to try to stay safe. And then we'll say, oh, their OCD is flaring up, or oh, they're really in this loop of when actually they're trying to stay safe. So I remember this one fellow where he used to touch the water fountain every morning. He would come in. We worked at a program for dually diagnosed people that had intellectual disabilities and mental health issues. And he would come in and he would touch the water fountain, and then he would have to have the staff help him with his belt. And the staff, usually it was Lisa Cloud, would help him with his belt. And she would calm him down. He'd be happy for the day. Like, oh, your belt's good. Thanks. Great. And he'd have a great day. And then one day he came in and he was at the water fountain for 45 minutes, touching it, and wouldn't stop. And he was getting help from Lisa with his belt, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't right. Over and over and over. And nothing would calm him down. And then he went and held himself and jumped up and down in a room by himself. Wouldn't even stop for lunch. And this happened day after day. So we called the residential, and then we said, he needs to see the psychiatrist. So many people with autism are diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorders. I believe that's because sometimes just what they need to do to stay safe to order their life as part of their autism can look like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So we dragged him over and said, oh, he has OCD, and he got medicated for it. But the medication didn't work. And then one day his housemate came in and said, Joe's doing the boom boom. He's doing the boom boom to him. And he didn't say many words, but he used all the words he could muster and told us that this poor fellow was being sexually abused. And he said, he tried to do it to me, but I hit him and I hit him and I hit him. So we called the residential agency. They said, we're calling the police. We got there with the police there, and they had the staff that was being accused of doing it right there. So neither one of them would say anything. One was non-speaking, and the other one, no one would say anything. They just shut down. The police said, we can't do anything. We raised a ruckus. Okay, they moved the staff. They didn't fire him. This agency is gone. I'm happy to say they got shut down for other reasons. And finally, this fellow calmed down. But then one day he came back and he was doing it again, and we didn't know why. And we called the residential, or Lisa did, and they said, oh yeah, Joe worked there this weekend. Then thank goodness they were shut down. He and his housemate were moved somewhere else, and they had been together for years in Rosewood, so they really needed each other. And he's 100% better, but because he finally feels safe. But those obsessions were an indication of his PTSD. He was avoiding, in his mind, if I touch the water fountain enough and straighten my belt and jump and everything will be okay, but it never was. People also dissociate. They can remove themselves from reality. Have you ever seen people just like not be present, not be there? I'm checking out because this world is too scary. Like we talked earlier about people who are selectively mute. Stop talking. I can't do it. I can't take it. I'm freezing and I won't talk because last time I talked, something horrible happened. See that response. Negative alteration in cognition and mood. This is called the sense of impending doom by psychologists. Many people lose all hope and they feel like, oh, there's nothing I can ever do to feel okay. We also see, and that nothing will ever work out for me, right? I'm a bad person and bad things will happen to me. That sense of shame as well. Like, I'm sorry, I'm a bad person, I did a bad thing. And then that hype, the last symptom area, we see that shame a lot, don't we? Probably a lot of you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes people cut themselves as well. Then that last symptom area is arousal, where people are in a hyper state, where they're easily aroused, where they're agitated, where I have somebody I'm working with who's broken 3 computers and 2 cell phones because he thinks he's going to get COVID and he gets upset or something and he starts breaking things. And because he's in a hyped up state and his staff say, oh, he's doing that for attention. No, he's getting lots of attention. No, he's doing that because he's in a freaked out, hyper aroused state and his brain is filled with cortisol and adrenaline because that amygdala is firing, telling him he's in danger. And it's not helping him any. So now we think about the people we work with, and when we put those trauma glasses on, we can see them a little differently, right? And see these symptoms and symptom areas, and wow, don't they all connect? And this is a fellow, oh, actually I can show that, but I'll show that next week. But I'm sorry, next week, it's tomorrow. Don't mean to confuse anyone. But I do want to end with this quote. And because Stephen Hawking says, the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It is, oh, look, I can't even read it. It's the illusion of knowledge. Sorry, my thing was over it. But how true is that? The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It's the illusion of knowledge. When we think we know is when we often make the worst mistakes, when we assume that people are being manipulative, or they just want something, or they're seeking attention, and maybe they're seeking connection. Maybe they're feeling desperate because they are so lonely. But that's not about attention. That's about being a human being. So at this point that I've gotten us all depressed, but this all rings true, right? Or at least some of it, I would assume, because, you know, everywhere I go, we talk about these things, and we see these patterns, and it's a hard, hard life. It's a life that requires courage, having an intellectual disability and having dealt with all that bullying and exclusion, and now dealing with the life that maybe isn't quite what you want, and maybe not being understood, all very tough. So I'd like to open it up for questions, and hopefully I can see the chat. There was discussion about discrimination and neighborhood violence. I have seen people who have witnessed violence being very traumatized by it. It doesn't mean that the violence had to happen to them. Just to resolve that question. I don't know if there are any questions. It's always so hard for me to stop for questions because I talk and talk and talk, and then I have another story I think of, and then, oh my gosh, I need to tell you this story. So, but I'm stopping myself.
Hey, Karen.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a question about the movie with Temple Grandin. What was the name of that movie?
Temple Grandin was the name.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And it's so good because you can really see her world. There's a wonderful book she wrote called The Way I See It that I highly recommend, where just her struggle is so clear. So maybe, I don't know, I'm afraid I might go over if I show the video of James, but this is somebody that I work with, and I'll set it up because we'll watch that tomorrow then. Because I was on a panel with him, and this was a Zoom thing. It was a national group supporting people with disabilities. I think it was NASDs, actually. It was one of the subgroups of NASDs. And they asked him to speak about his history of abuse. And they asked me to be there to just say how prevalent it was and how it's something that needs to be addressed. And then we had two other people, and we had an audience that was mixed. We had some people, case managers, providers, service coordinators, and we had a number of people who were receiving services. And it was just riveting because he opened up about his abuse, and then person after person, we had an open format for discussion, unmuted, and started sharing stories of being sexually abused, the people receiving supports. And it was so heartbreaking, but so important. And, you know, we could say these statistics, but when you see it, it's just so tragic, as though people have a target on their back. And we have to change that. We have to do more sex education. We have to figure out, you know, ways to help people to be empowered. And I know we can. Nora Baladarian has a series of workbooks on risk reduction that are very helpful. But then James, who was on this panel, put his number on the chat privately to me and said, will you call me? I really need to talk. And I was like, sure. And I called him up, and he said, why is it that when I talk about this, I know that it wasn't my fault, but it brings up a feeling of shame? And that's so many people who've been the victim of trauma. Like, there's something wrong with me. I'm a bad person. This happened to me because of something wrong with me. And he tells his story in this video that I made with him. And it's very, very badly made. I'll have to apologize in advance because it's just me pressing record on the Zoom, and then I talk too much on top of it. But what he says is so important. So, and it really shows how people who have trauma have so much, you know, such a deep feeling about it, even if it's happened years ago. So often they carry it with them, especially when they haven't gotten treatment, or the treatment that was focused on their real pain. Sometimes people, the treatment has been focused on their behavioral issues, which are merely a symptom of their PTSD and not the core. So we'll start with that tomorrow, but then we'll go to good things, I promise. We'll talk about healing. We'll talk about how people heal. We'll talk about what we can train our staff to do in order to facilitate healing. And we'll look at how people can move forward in their lives. I don't see any other questions. unless I'm not looking in the right place. So thank you. Thank you all for your attention. And thank you to the interpreter for doing a great job, or interpreters. Thank you so much. And I'm so appreciative. And I thank you all for coming. I really appreciate that, you know, you care enough to listen, and you're there for people. And thank you for all you've done throughout COVID. You guys are great. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to end the webinar.